Not really.
Oh, do you have a party trick?
I had a bright idea.
Did it do some nice little thing? Watch you guys. Ooh, I'm louder. I didn't think that was possible. Welcome, one and all, to From Books for Stephanie Sy-Quia's event, where she's going to be reading from her new book, Amnion. We're very excited to have Stephanie here this evening. We are, of course, very pleased to see a few real-life human beings inside the Shopland event, but also hello to all of the people on YouTube through the lens of the camera up above the till. Yes, we're going to start off. I think Stephanie's just going to do some reading from the book. We'll have a little chat about it, how it came to be, and sort of, various sort of thoughts and all kinds of sort of strange and unusual things going on here. And then another little reading, and then some questions from the floor. So, without further ado, I'm going to go and hide all the way over there and invite Stephanie to the stage. So, a round of applause for Stephanie, please.
Hello, thank you all so much for coming. I'm so excited to be here. Tom and I met many years ago at Shakespeare Company in Paris, and we actually re-encountered one another completely by chance because my brother went to university in York City, and we all came here for his graduation, and we were walking from our Airbnb just down the road to the restaurant, and we passed the bookshop, and my mum, sister, and I went, "Ooh, a beautiful bookshop." We walked in, and then Tom was stood behind the till, and we both just sort of stared at each other in wonderment, and my mum still talks about it to this day. It was amazing. It was like two people from the underworld recognizing one another. So I'm going to actually do a slightly, I assume, unusual thing today, and start by reading someone else's work very, very briefly. This is sort of like a live epigraph. So this is from Will Harris's collection, Rendang, which is also on the grantor list. It was the first book on the grantor list, and it's very good, so you should go and read it. Will and I have quite a lot in common in that he also is sort of like from somewhere else at several removes, and that origin story is quite complicated. So I'm just going to read a section of his poem, The White Jumper. The Nazis admired Caspar David Friedrich for his blood and soil vision. In several paintings, two friends contemplate the moon, which seems to be exploding. One shows the blast in its white heat. Another has the sky a darker blue, the moon dark too. The moon is down. I have not heard the clock. A friend rests his hand against another's shoulder to console him. I know that blood stands for race and soil for nation, but blood and soil makes me think of bloodied soil. Do some people imagine themselves in the same relation to their place of birth as a scab to a wound? And I'm just going to read from the beginning of Amnion in a section that I think tessellates in quite interesting ways with what I've just read from Will's work. I'm trying to think if there's any contextual knowledge you need. Yes. So the massacre of Manila was when the Japanese army were retreating from Manila, the capital of the Philippines, at the end of the Second World War, because the Americans were advancing. And it was some of the most vicious fighting with some of the highest civilian casualties. Actually, no, that's not true. It was some of the most vicious fighting in the Pacific theater of war, because the Japanese were kind of retreating street by street through the streets of Manila. And it was really, tough fighting that went on for months. But as the Japanese army were pushed back, they would, in reprisal, go into kind of every house that they passed and round up 2 Filipino men for every Japanese soldier killed and shoot them. And then they would take the bodies away so that, their loved ones were never able to kind of get their remains and, perform last rites for them. And trying to think of this. Yes, so dum-dum fire is a type of semi-heavy artillery fire, which the bullet is designed to explode on impact. So it's designed to make a much bigger wound than just, the entry wound. And Lola is like Nana, it's the term of address for grandmother in Tagalog. If we are to go back again, there were 3 sisters, great aunts, by names of Faye, Esperanza, and Caridad. In the under-discussed massacre of Manila, February 1945, Faye was widowed in the 2-for-1 street-by-street Japanese retreat. At the creak of bootstep on the stair, she bassinet snatched her sleeping baby and hid in a cupboard. Sure enough, in comes a soldier, and from the cupboard crack, Faye can see he bassinet bayonets immediately. Esperanza became a vegan and a nun. Now she mothers Superior and Carmelite near Loag. Shall I entertain you with the fetishism of a foreign name? My father, when a little boy, was taken to the visiting room, which is latticed split, and asked, "Are you a bird? Because you are in a cage." Caridad was 5 years wed and childless, an enigma to all invested. She sustained dum-dum fire in the same said Japanese retreat, caught in crossfire on the walk home from consoling the women of her family. Brother, father, men all rounded up. A soldier, sniper lane, and a radius drawn from where he fell, from which to take all the men to be found. Caridad's husband, gesturing from a first-floor window for her to stop, but she misread him, and he jumped as she fell in the street, a bullet expanding in her back. Luckily, her neighbor was an obstetrician and stitched her up face down between the stirrups, having only whiskey to clean what would become a fist-fit hollow in her back. He had time to see her uterus was retrograde, so he rectified, and Lola was born in March of 1946. So I read those two in conjunction, Will's poem and mine, because I think that's quite a worthwhile way of thinking about origins. I come from a very international family, and so when people ask me where I'm from, it's a very difficult question to answer. And the fact that, my great-grandmother might never have had any children, had it not been for the fact that she got shot in the back in World War II. I find that very relevant information. So when people ask me where I'm from, it's hard for me to kind of boil the detail down to a really concise reply, to which end I'm going to read you another section later in the book. Okay. So your mum is Filipino. Filipina, if you're a woman, like Latina, same empire. So your mum is Filipina? No, my dad. Oh, where are you from? My reply, only as of late. I'm British, but was born in the States and grew up in France, and I'm part Filipina. Oh, okay, wow. So your mum is half Filipina. Where are you from? Where are you from? My mother is British but grew up in West Germany, and my father is Filipino but grew up in Spain, and they met here but had me in California, and then moved to France, and now I am here. Oh, okay, wow. Where are you from? My grandmother on my dad's side is Filipina, but was exiled to Spain for getting pregnant, and my grandfather on my mum's side was a Catholic priest, and there is a gap in the story. The story resumes when he has been defrocked, and they are married, and they fled the scandal to Libya to be teachers, and my mother was born there, and from there they went to West Germany, and my parents met here, but left when their friends turned back into their English upper-middle-class parents, so went to California, and there they had me, but then they moved to France, where we lived for 11 years, and now I am here. Oh, okay, wow. Oh, okay, wow. no room in their view for people like me. Now I'm just going to flick back. Sorry, I'm ping-ponging a bit through the book. Maybe I can ask you actually, what would you like to hear about? Would you like to hear about my mum's side of the family or my dad's side of the family? Name a decade in the 20th century and we'll see where we land. Anyone?
Tell us about Ferdinand Marcos.
Excellent choice, Tom. Okay, hang on, let me just find the... Bear with me a second. Right. Okay, I'm just going to read the section that Tom is alluding to, which comes to the end of this sequence. So, in fact, where Tom and I met Shakespeare and Company has this amazing, unbroken view of Notre Dame Cathedral. I don't know if any of you have been to Shakespeare and Company, but it's very wonderful. And so, around the time when I was just starting to take this project seriously was when I met Tom, and when I was at Shakespeare and Company, which kind of, offered the environment for many of us. Well, speaking for myself with the snappers, we're given the kind of context in which we were given the space to really start to think about ourselves seriously as writers and start to take our writerly ambitions seriously, which was very invaluable and why they are in the acknowledgements. But I was very taken with Notre Dame. It was one of the first places that my mum took my brother and I to see when we first moved to France. So I have a very vivid memory of seeing it for the first time. And when there was the fire a couple of years ago, I remember very clearly that I was chopping an onion when I sort of heard the news that Notre Dame was on fire. And then the next time I sort of tuned in, I was frying the onion I had chopped and the spire had fallen, and I was crying. And anyway, it had a very big impact on me. And I was very sort of preoccupied by the fact that Notre Dame is this incredibly beautiful structure, and that's true of so many religious buildings. They're very beautiful, but they also represent an agenda of, in many cases, they represent what can be a very repressive agenda of control. And I wanted to hold those two things in symbiosis, or not even in symbiosis, but hold them both at the same time, and that something like Notre Dame can transcend its original function. It can be beloved by people who are not ostensibly religious, and can take on this enormous civic significance. And I was very taken by how in the French Revolution religious buildings, Catholic buildings, were very targeted, because the Catholic Church was one of their great discontents, and with good reason. Anyway, in the Revolution, they hacked the bells from their beams, and weighing 6 tons, they crashed through the towers to crack. We knew Huguenots, a many times great-grandfather of whom was sent to row himself to death, his name on a memorial board high in the Cevennes, where people came running with their faith rolled up in their arms, made flat-pack pulpits to fold into barrels, made Bibles so small women could hide them in their hair. Those friends' daughter, aged 6, was asked on a history test. Louis XIV was A, a monarch, B, a president, C, a dictator. When she circled C and her teacher gave a red no, her father demanded a meeting to say to her he was a dictator. Cluny, before Rome, was the biggest church in the Christian world until Napoleon ordered its de-bricking for a riding school. One side tower remains, and large bronze medallions through the town mark out where you would have been walking up the nave or near the font. In that other city, you can see the footprint where the wall used to be, and sometimes small signs. 1st of August 1964, 2 Personen Flucht. I am interested in this Flucht, which is flight as in to flee, but also to fly. But they did not fly. They flung a carpet over the wire and one broken ankle. There is a rye field which will never be harvested, where the rusted wrought iron cross of a church which was blown up and blown open has been left, mangled, and looking not unlike an outdated combine harvester set aside. My mother's tears are rolling to meet the twilit rye, and when the word flee is used, it normally entails something more boxy than the flowing trenchcoat coattails conjured, fake papers, battered suitcases full of random, utmost precious things, the last train out of here. The wall, which like other things my mother held to be immutable, was not. Also in the revolution, facade dragged, and behold, beheaded, the price of bread henceforth is fixed, and we shall rename all the days. Pull time from its appointed slots, and it shall run in grooves of 10 from here on in. This we wish our freedom form to take. In the end they were mistaken. These were not the kings of France, but those of Judah. Lola's family lawyer had the name of Ferdinand Marcos. Depending on who she's speaking to, Lola will say with pride that the getaway car for his wedding was loaned by the family, or that it was my great-grandmother's shoe collection that gave Imelda the idea for her 3,000 pairs of shoes. My great-grandmother did not have 3,000 pairs of shoes. But to me, she will say, Carrie Dad, my great-grandmother, she is the jade and pearls and the cigarette holder and the dining table which could seat 60. She was outspoken against him, and she held open house each and every Sunday and fostered conversation among dissidents, journalists, friends. And though this was martial law and like many other places in this century, a time of nights where black cars could come slinking to snitch you for the secret police, they never dared touch her. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Hang on, let me just grab some chairs because might as well be luxurious. Have we chat? Get us a chair. That's fine. You're going to really worry about that because we have air cleaning machines right next to us, so
Okay.
We are reasonably safe. I think, hopefully, just about. Let's see if I can. Make horrible noise.
Very easy done.
Yeah. Eat your heart out, Adam Biles. Adam Biles is the events organizer at Shakespeare and Company. So yes, Stephanie, lovely to have you in the shop, of course, and so it's lovely to remember sort of our meeting at Shakespeare and Company, and it turned out I hadn't realised, but of course I'm wearing their jumper today, so we're properly representing the Shakes and Co. People just now. I suppose the first thing that I wanted to ask you about your book is, were we to be back at Shakespeare and Company, where the hell would we shelve it? Because it's very, I mean, I know that technically, yes, this is poetry, but there are long sort of prose sections. It's very biographical. There's lots of different things going on, the way in which you've used your family history and personal history to explore various ideas. And I just sort of wonder, what was your sort of inspiration for the structure of the book, first of all? How did you plan it?
Well, I think first off, with regards to where you would put it in a bookshop, the easy answer is poetry. For ease of stocking, it would be poetry. But I did write it not necessarily thinking it would be a poem. I started writing it in prose, and it didn't have the sort of weight that I wanted it to. So I started putting line breaks in pretty much at random at first, and then I sort of catch myself saying these things, and I think, you sound pretentious, but it felt as if it could suddenly breathe, and that's what it had always wanted to be all along. And poetry is a very good way of, if something presents as a poem, i.e. it has line breaks, like the text doesn't go all the way to the page, to the edge of the page, it's a very good way of making people think, this is poetry. This is a serious text that has been like simmered for many an hour, and I must approach it with, due, maybe not reverence, but I'm allowed to read this slowly. And ideally, people would kind of approach it with that kind of attitude of, this is a text that I want to have sort of percolate over time. And also, the text arose from people asking me where I was from, and that being a really tricky question to answer. And eventually I just got so frustrated with the question, because I think the question is, are you talking about where I was born, or the country that I hold a passport to, or where my parents are from, or where, and of course with my parents and with my grandparents, that question is frustrated by, none of them lived in the country they were ostensibly from. So it's, it's this dislocation that happens at several removes. And so I got frustrated with the kind of, the impulse to categorize, the impulse to kind of label people up in a way that, sort of makes them easy to identify and easy to pigeonhole. And so the book is a kind of, through its form, I think, a rebuke of categorization by design. And in terms of its structure, I think I was basically quite skeptical about institutions, and those range from, the nuclear family to sort of nations, because a sense of national belonging is. Do you remember you used to run that Tumbleweed blog and you interviewed me for it? And I said, one of your questions was like, name a song that you really like or something. And I said, I Vow to Be My Country, an incredibly moving song, but also really weird, because I'm never going to understand. I'm never going to have that emotion for a place. And therefore, like, it's just the emotion expressed in that song is very foreign to me. And I used to have a sort of sense of grief about that, and I don't anymore.
Okay, well, I mean, good, I would hope, yes. Was it nationalism is the last resort of the scoundrel, I believe. It's a quotation, isn't it? Yeah. So, if we're starting off with sort of some really sort of simple things, the title of the book, Amnion, there's a sort of strong sort of sense that because I've done quite a lot of I told you earlier, I've been reaching for the dictionary a fair bit, which for me is unusual. I'm a bit of a word geek, but I was reaching for the dictionary a bit and trying to work it out. And I thought, amnion, that'll be like amniotic fluid, it'll be something to do with birth. And so, it's this sort of idea of it being a sort of sack and everything. And it's this idea of being a sack. It's this idea of being a sack of words, really, isn't it, Steph? But it's the idea. But I suppose, do you feel that because a lot of the content of the book is very, very personal and very specific to you. And I know that you don't necessarily want to sort of go into detail on every single part of it, or there's some areas of it that it's personal, but it's sort of But do you have that kind of feeling like it's something that's in a way being birthed? That there's this sort of visceral relationship going on. Especially when you consider so much of it is like your sort of family history, and a lot of that is going to be about your own sort of background. Do you feel that sort of a big part of it?
Yeah, definitely. There are so many things I could say in response to this question. So the title is a word that I saw in a biology textbook when I was 15, and I thought, oh, that is the thing. That's the name of the thing that I've been tinkering with for a couple of months. And so it's been the title for a really, really long time. And I think, so it's the innermost membrane of the amniotic sac. So, we've all been in one, basically. And then there's the first shelter. It's an environment where we are allowed to kind of grow and get ready to enter the world. But of course, part of being born and becoming truly alive and, setting on our way to become who we're supposed to be is to break out of the ambience. So I thought it was an interesting way of talking about the structures which enclose us and protect us only for a time. And actually, like, the work of being alive and being a person is to be becoming all the time. Like, we never stop growing up. I think, well, none of us should be aiming for that anyway, a point of sort of stasis where you've arrived. I think that the work of becoming is a never-ending, I mean, if I say never-ending task, that makes it sound terrible, but it's a way of thinking about how, we outgrow structures that can give us shelter for a time, and that's a big part of growing up. And with regards to kind of writing about my family history, yeah, I did feel that I had this family history that didn't fit in the metrics of passport holder, born, grew up, because there were so many ruptures, and there's a lot of, there are painful stories for why that's the case. And there's this great Anne Carson quotation about, her mother saying, or the speaker's mother saying to her, you've been carrying that for such a long time, why don't you give it up? And the speaker says, well, where can I put it down? And I wanted to create a space in this book. This is my way of putting it down and finding a place, making a structure that honors all that family history and gives it its due, and also saying, I'm gonna, I mean, of course it will always be with me, but I'm gonna house you adequately now. And with regards to the kind of pressure and momentum of writing it, it did take me a very long time. It took me 9 years, and around about the middle, I would say, of the writing process, I was at university, and I went to a very sort of maximalist, quite irritating adaptation of a Greek play, which was in ancient Greek and had these like very, high-end set design that was sort of all quite conceptual, and also had a sort of like synth band doing the Greek chorus. It was just a lot in many different directions. There was a lot to deal with, and of course it was an adaptation of the Euripides. What's the final installment of the Oresteia? Does anyone know?
Oh,
it was called The Furies.
Yeah.
But anyway, so it's the trial of Orestes for the murder of his mother, Clytemnestra. And it begins with the Furies, who are just these kind of, demon spirits from the underworld, I think, having rocked up. And the play began with one of these Furies who was just sort of like a bit, they were sort of all made up as if they were kind of fallen angels, basically, and quite grubby. And she comes on dragging what's supposed to be a corpse, the corpse of Clytemnestra, which is sort of like, some kind of dummy that's got lots of like matted hair and like congealed blood and stuff wrapped up in that kind of industrial, plastic sheeting, basically. And so this Fury kind of like trudges across the stage, like dragging this thing. And that was kind of how I was feeling about the book at that point, that it was just this like thing that I was dragging around, and I needed to sort of give it shape and like send it on its way, because it was just sort of gnawing at me and eating me up inside.
Well, okay. Of course, being a direct quotation from the book, which is available here at Type on the Books at a very reasonable price of $10.99. Yes, the sort of the way in which this book is actually very close to you is interesting. I noticed that throughout it, you're sort of writing about your parents now. Your parents meet. You're not writing about your grandparents. You're also writing about yourself. And a lot of the time, the stories seem to be going in parallel. So I imagine that was a sort of conscious decision. You wanted to make a sort of link there. But I think that, I suppose one thing that I definitely have to ask about is, I can't stop anymore. Why is there a cock and balls drawn in the middle of your book? In ASCII art? I mean, is that just, some poor editor at Granta has just, decided they've had enough and they've stuck that in there, or what's going on?
So for reference, Tom and I were chatting about the book before you all arrived, and he said, "Why have you got an ASCII cock and balls in the book?" And I felt my face fall, because I thought, what is he talking about? And I'd never heard the term asking before.
Yeah.
But basically there is a penis delineated through judicious deployment of end dashes, hyphens, and brackets, sort of around halfway through the book, and this is just a kind of my best representation that I could do of when I went to boarding school in the UK, which was a complicated experience for many reasons. On my first day, my first assembly, one of the other girls in my boarding house who was sort of sitting in the row with us in the assembly hall, she grabbed my hymn book, which at this point was pristine. It was a cathedral school, so we all had to have hymn books with us for every assembly. And she just proceeded to kind of deface it with like the most salacious things she could come up with. So Jesus is hot was one of them. Lots of penises, lots of ejaculating penises scribbled all over, I've outstayed my country, and, fast falls the eventide, and, onwards Christian soldiers, all of those, all the bangers. Because the whole point was, you couldn't have a pristine hymn book. Everybody went around with these kind of graffitied hymn books. And so then by the time she was done, she kind of handed it back to me and said, you're welcome. You won't be a pariah anymore.
There's a lot of sort of elements of kind of religious phraseology and terminology throughout the book, and also in sort of church architecture. And again, I find myself sort of reaching for the dictionary a fair bit. I suppose, obviously, with the school that you were at, that would have a profound effect on your life. But I've seen it sort of making its way through the book, things just sort of as a casual addition of in metaphor. Was that something that you deliberately wanted to lace throughout? And do you want to talk maybe a little bit more about that?
Definitely. It was a very, very deliberate effort on my part. I am a big fan of metaphysical poets, and at university, I had a great time studying all of the, raunchier metaphysical poets. So your John Donnes, your Andrew Marvell's, and it got to the end of term and I had one essay left, and I didn't, I ran out of raunchy metaphysicals, and I was very sad. And my tutor said, you should read George Herbert, who's a devotional poet, religious poet, which John Donne did a bit of that, but it was kind of intermixed with all the love poetry in a very cool way. And I just remember feeling really disheartened, because I thought, I don't want to do that. Like, I don't want to study a religious poet. That'll be boring. Anyway, but he said, you haven't got a choice because you haven't got any other ideas of what to study. So I went off and I read The Temple, which was published in 1630, and it just completely blew my mind. But it's basically got over 100 poems in it, with, I think, no repetition of form. So it's got over 100 different forms, poetic forms, and it's called The Temple, and it starts with a poem entitled The Church Steps. And then the next poem is the church floor, and then you have the church windows, and then you have the altar, and I think there are a couple more. So there's a lot of other stuff going on in there, but basically you enter the temple, as it were, via the steps, and so it's this kind of metaphysical construction of a church made out of text. And the conclusion of the temple, sorry, I'm just going to put that down. The conclusion of the temple is basically that, and George Herbert was a Church of England priest at a time when, that was a bit more contentious than it is now, let's say. The conclusion of the temple is that you build a church in the mind, and that's kind of, a basic tenet of being a good Protestant, or just, a good person who practices their faith. Which of course looks forward to the great Thomas Paine's "My only mind is my church." Oh, sorry, my only church is my mind. And that notion really, really appealed to me, and it ends on this beautiful moment of basically, Jesus inviting you to like rest and eat. And, you know, I was like, I'm not a religious person, and organized religion has been the source of immense pain in my family. And that's a big part of what the book is about. But, you know, I can sign on for that kind of thing. That sounds quite nice. And so I wanted Amnion is very, very informed by the structure of the temple in terms of making a structure out of text and allowing it to house that which has been exiled from the main narrative. So, you know, my grandmother being sent to live thousands of miles away from everyone she knew because she got pregnant and she brought shame on her family, or my grandfather on my other side, which, you know, we barely got onto this, was a Catholic priest, and he met my grandmother and fell in love with her, and he got defrocked, so he was, you know, dismissed from being a priest in circumstances that can, you know, maximize his humiliation. And also he'd grown up Catholic, so, you know, Catholicism was his upbringing, his community, how he derived status in the world. It was his job. All of his colleagues were Catholic priests or nuns, you know, and he was just kind of completely cast out. And, you know, being in the wilderness really is the apt metaphor here. But like, he wasn't of this, you know, this thing that had structured his whole life, and they just booted him out the back door, or even the front door, so that they could, you know, make sure that he was, you know, traumatized for life, basically. And so because my family has, you know, a history of kind of painful fractures, in that way, where it's sort of members of my family and my ancestors have kind of, well, ancestors feels like a kind of slightly grandiose word, but definitely, you know, my grandparents have had to exist outside of the structures which sustained them their whole lives, and, you know, that's been hard. I wanted to create something where their stories would be safe and sufficiently honored, and so I wanted to build a cathedral where they might claim sanctuary, and, you know, ideally, hopefully, where people with similar stories to tell can also, you know, stop and feel that their experience is acknowledged. Because that was the other thing, you know, I didn't think that my family history was adequate material for a narrative, precisely because it kind of defied narrative. There were so many breaks and ruptures. And then when I was 14 years old, I was in the school library and I saw Michael Ondaatje's The English Patient that was kind of, you know, propped up and looking at me. And I borrowed it and I read it, and it sort of, most of it went over my head at the age of 14, but I kind of, it was one of those things that percolated over an incredibly long time. And then I thought, oh my God, like, he can make a novel out of lots of, you know, anecdotes and like fractured stories. And if he can do it, then that means that I can do it. And that was the first text I'd encountered where narrative was so troubled, but a book was still the result. And that was a really big deal for me.
Well, I suppose it's the other thing I did want to ask you about is that obviously you're telling your own story in the book. You're also telling the stories of your parents, your grandparents, and, you know, your perception and understanding of that might not necessarily always go with what they saw or felt or experienced. So there's a bit sort of later on in the book where I think you're sort of, I don't know if this is any, like, is this sort of verbatim stuff that you've taken from them? Right, okay, so when they're sort of responding. So I thought, how important was it for you to get that sort of part in there and that sort of element into the work?
Well, I'm really glad you've asked me this question, actually, because this is something that I want to talk about. But it's true. So, you know, I take a lot of details from both of my grandmother's lives. You know, my maternal grandfather has been dead for 20 years, and my paternal grandfather has never been in the picture. So I take details from both of my grandmother's lives, which, you know, are very sensitive, more sensitive than the details I take from my parents' lives. And when I I'd been approached by an agent, and I said, I'm working on this thing, but I can't show it to you until I have sent it to my family, because they don't know that I'm working on it, and I can't, in good conscience, show it to you until I have received their blessing to proceed with trying to get it published. So, he said, okay, well, it sounds really interesting, so, send it to them now, which I did. No, that's not true. It was already underway, and he said, well, I look forward to seeing it whenever it's ready, if it's ever ready. And so I sent it to my parents and my grandmothers, and I said, do I have your blessing to proceed with trying to get this published? This is something I've been working on for a long time, and I'm actually not interested in whether or not I have gotten minor factual things wrong. I am more concerned about whether or not you feel I have fundamentally mishandled this material. And so, don't worry too much about whether something happened in Munich or in Hamburg, but tell me if you feel that I have done this badly in a fundamental way. And my grandmothers are very, very different. There's a 20-year age gap between them, but they have seen a lot more of one another than many other grandmothers, certainly in sort of European family structures. And they get on really well. I mean, they've modeled a really unusual and really beautiful relationship for me my whole life. And in Tagalog, there is a term for that relationship, which is balae. So in the final section of the book opens with little sections entitled Balae 1 and Balae 2, which are these verbatim, in the case of my paternal grandmother, in the case of my paternal grandmother, an email that she sent me after I'd sent her the manuscript, and in the case of my maternal grandmother, a transcript of a phone call, that I had with her. And so I love that word balae because it signals the relationship that they have to each other. And I also think it speaks volumes that we don't have an equivalent term of address in English, because the relationship that basically mothers-in-law or grandmothers would have to one another, it doesn't really exist as a relationship in the way that we structure our extended families in England. Anyway, and so I had this phone call with my maternal grandmother where she very meticulously went through the text page by page, every single kind of mention of herself and allusion to herself, and she would query it and say, that's not true. So she did what I said not to do, and focused on the factual inaccuracies. And she said at several points, well, that's really untrue, and I don't want that in the text. And I had gone into this interaction thinking, how am I going to navigate the eventuality of them saying, don't put that in there? Or, well, don't put that in there is different from, I don't want that in there. There's a small nuance. And just kind of saying, you're wrong about this quite major speculation and that kind of thing. And that was how I ended. And she was quite agitated. Like, I was conscious of the fact that but she also said, I think this is very beautiful and a great achievement. And that meant a great deal to me, because she actually doesn't read that much poetry, but the poetry the texts that she really loves include, T.S. Eliot and stuff. Right. So, the poetry she does read is done to a very high standard. So that meant a lot. And it was a very profound interaction with my grandmother, who is 95. And then with my other grandmother, she sent me an email, again, just pointing out minor factual inaccuracies, but not saying anything else. And it was one of the most profound interactions I have ever had with my grandmother. And it was really beautiful because, tacit in that email was, I give you my blessing and go. Like, I endorse this message. And that was such an incredible gift. And that happened, 18 months ago now. So it's quite funny because I think at the time I just completely, took the blessings and ran for my life. And now that it's being published, I wonder whether I am worried that maybe I haven't done sufficiently well by them. But then the inclusion of those two sections at the start of the last part of the book, Balae 1 and Balae 2, which are, just copy and pasted of an email and a transcript of a phone call, was my way of giving them the last laugh. And so actually, the things that my maternal grandmother was worried about in the text, I haven't changed, but I have included her saying, well, you're wrong about that. And I think that that's a good way of handing it back to them and actually allowing them to undermine my version of events, because then the question becomes, well, whose story is it really?
Yes, but I mean, this is the wonderful thing about any form of biography, really, and autobiography especially, is that it tends to be really something that should be shelved in fiction, because we all tell stories of our lives, and it's about your own interpretation and perception. Now, I was interested to discover that these were genuine verbatim accounts, but excellent. I suppose the one other thing I wanted to ask about, or maybe comment on, is that just towards the very end of the book, we're coming right up to date, and you're sort of putting together a few ideas about what you think about marriage and what you think about sort of interpersonal relationships and the world for you, because we've had your history, where you've come from, your background, who you are, but then also you've got this other sort of little step in there, where how do you interact with other people once you know who you are. And so I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Well, again, thank you for a great question that I'm champing at the bit to answer. Although having just said that, there's a bit in the book where I say I'm very skeptical of people who use kind of like horse metaphors when it comes to, they're often applied to women, like it's a very sexist subset of metaphor, so I should stop using that figure of speech. So the departure point of the book is the fact that my parents got married when they were 21. If you ask my dad about it, he will say that, he knew my mum was the one and it was for love, and they're still together, 33 years later. It's an irony not lost on me, actually, that when my parents' marriage reaches l'âge du Christ, it's when I had a book coming out just being like, family history. Anyway, so they got married. But if you ask my mum, she will say that, this was her boyfriend of 2 years, whom she loved very much. But he was Filipino, and his student visa expired. And so, he was going to be deported back to the Philippines, where he didn't get on very well with his extended family. And of course, the Philippines, in 1988 was really very far away from London. And so my mum said, okay, well, I'll marry you then. And they got married. And as I say, they weren't very in love at the time. But if you ask him, he'll say, I knew that this was it for life. And if you ask her, she'll say, well, I liked the idea of marrying him, but I thought it was going to happen 5 years later, kind of thing. And that was really the departure point and end point for this whole book, was trying to honor, yes, my grandparents' history, absolutely, but also, the leap of faith and of imagination that involved. And that, basically, like, they got married in 1988. My mum had grown up in West Germany. This was a time of kind of immense and beautiful civilian unrest that achieved real results, the end of apartheid in South Africa, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the fall of the USSR more generally. And I think obviously it's immensely moving to me, and it's part of the reason why I'm here today, but I find it quite amusing as well that, basically one of the most radical things my mum has ever done which was to kind of, make a Filipino man a British citizen, was also enacted through like the underpinning of mainstream society, i.e. marriage. And so the final part of Amnion is this kind of looking at the institution of marriage and trying to reorient it, because my parents' relationship has had a huge impact on me growing up, and I really idolized it. But they also modeled kinship systems outside of the norm. So they have a network of family friends of lots of different ages. My dad has tellingly, she's called Stephanie, woman who would basically take him in during the school holidays so that he could avoid going back to Barcelona where he had a horrible stepfather. So he kind of refers to her as like an unofficial godmother. But she, when her husband died, he referred to him as his real father. And so I say that as context to the fact that they have the idea of a family friend is quite expansive. It contains someone who may have had a parenting role in their lives, or definitely someone who contributed in a really major way. And similarly, I feel that I, through my parents, inherited family friends who contributed to my construction as a person in ways that my parents wouldn't have been able to. And I feel so lucky that I got those figures in my life. And friendship is something which is just, it's a form of very radical love, which is unsanctified in our society precisely because it's unproductive. And I wanted to honor that. And so I wanted to sort of, the final part of the book is looking at marriage, but specifically a wedding ceremony. And historically, and through many of the etiquettes of a wedding ceremony, they enact this kind of like patriarchal exchange of a woman, from her father's family to her husband's family kind of thing. And my parents had a very untraditional wedding. Like, they just got married in a registry office. None of their parents were there. It was, I think they had 5 guests, all of whom were friends, 4 of whom they're still in touch with today, that kind of thing. And so I wanted to kind of reorient the idea of what we're doing when we have a marriage ceremony, as this is not a patriarchal exchange of basically property. It is for the consolidation of wealth or the joining of families or whatever. It's actually saying all the people I've invited here today, and I hasten to add, actually, I say this as an unmarried person, so I'm very much projecting into the future, but I have friendships in my life which sustain me to such a great extent, and they're such an amazing force for good in my life, and I wanted to honor them as well and honor that love. And so when you get married, you invite lots of people, and it's actually saying thank you to everyone you've invited, to say thank you for making me the person who's capable of embarking on this kind of like wild adventure. And actually, you're all here because I love you so much. And so the end of the book is about that, is about celebrating friendship and kind of, I'm not saying we should burn all the institutions to the ground, be that, marriage or nations or the nuclear family, but I am saying there's a more expansive path that we can walk together, and that is a beautiful, beautiful thing.
Oh, marvelous. Well, thank you, Stephanie, and I think we could maybe open up to the floor if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask.
Yes, I've got a comment rather than I think it's really beautiful the way you look back through those generations from you, and I think it's really lost in terms of history more widely, and having sort of also other sort of things in my family that go back across different continents and things, and how discovering that for me has been like interesting in terms of how the nuclear family has sanctioned some of those bits in terms of like, well, what is that? Is that racism? And where do I feel I belong? I belong to those people. Who am I? And that bit about like, who am I now? And it's not that you belong in a place, that you are the contribution of these really rich relationships and people along the way. So that was lovely for me to hear that from people.
Thank you so much. Have you read the book already?
No, I haven't. No.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much. That means a lot to me. And yeah, I think it's exactly that. I want people to think about their family histories. One comment I've had a lot of is people saying, oh, my family histories are really boring. And, there's nothing interesting in my family history. And I think there's really no such thing. Like, tell me what boring means. Like, yes, the Ferdinand Marcos was the solicitor, but it's not like, I hasten to add, it's not as if we helped him in, well, I say we, it's not as if my family, assisted him in his bid to become the dictator of the Philippines.
This is good. I don't know. I mean, I wasn't trying for an expose or anything.
No. But it's just kind of like, I come back to my point of there's no such thing as an uninteresting family history. And I just think that, it's very important to kind of ask of families like, well, why do I only know about, my grandfather fighting in World War II and not about what my grandmother was doing, or, that kind of thing. And so it's just, I think that, everyone has a very important story to tell and define interesting, everything is interesting.
Thanks. Well, no, yes, I'm absolutely. Do anyone else want to jump in?
I was going to ask about like a family reaction. You mentioned your grandmothers or how your parents had sort of responded. I presume they probably read it by now. Have they reacted to it?
I didn't tell my family that I was working on this, and I worked on it for 9 years. So I think they felt a little bit like, you've been paying a lot of close attention for a long time, and you kept that one quiet. But no, I think it was tough for them. Like there's stuff in the book which, is hard for them to read. And I guess for that reason, I feel immensely lucky that they did say yes. This is where I come back to the idea of kind of like, you don't really hang around for people to say yes and. You just take the yes and you run for your life. And then publication day comes and you start to think, no, they were very, they have been very supportive, and I am very, very lucky in that regard. But I think that, if anyone else is working on a similar project, like I was actually talking to Alice Hiller, who has written a staggering, harrowing book, and she said, worst comes to worst, the people who are unhappy about being written about, all they need to do is close the book. And that's not the case with my family, but I think that what I tried to do was honor the truth, which is not necessarily the same as getting to the bottom of what the truth is. Because, the next book I'm working on is an expansion of my maternal grandparents' story. So the fact that my grandfather was a Catholic priest, and as I say, he's been dead for 20 years, but I tried to sit my nana down and say, what really happened. And she wouldn't tell me. I mean, the answers I got were sort of interesting in that they were completely pockmarked. They left out nouns. I didn't know who she was talking about. They didn't have active verbs, so it was kind of nonsensical, and I don't know whether that's her wanting to take that story to her grave or her genuinely not remembering anymore, but either way, that's her prerogative, and at the end of the day, I have to respect it. I can't just extract it from her like a tooth, and so honor the truth and do it with compassion, and then you will have done your best, and that's, I think, all you can really hope for. And and I set out to do it with good intentions. I like to think that I tried to do it in a way that would give that pain somewhere to kind of a quiet place to rest, finally, you know?
And yeah,
Actually, why not? Thank you for the brief and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned previous generation and end of apartheid, sort of the Berlin Wall. I haven't read the book yet, but when I flipped through, I noticed you mentioned 9/11 a couple of times.
Sorry?
Notice I mentioned 9/11.
Oh, yeah. Just once, actually, I think.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So what impacts do you think that had on your generation and on the family?
Oh, what impact did 9/11? Yeah. It's an interesting question because I was born in the States. My mother is British and my father is British by virtue of being married to her. And they had met in the UK. But then I grew up in France. We moved to France when I was 7. So we moved to France in 2002. And then some of my earliest memories of being in France are of the 8 o'clock news being full of footage of the Iraq War. And of course, the French refused to go to war in Iraq. The American response, which I write about in the book, was one of complete outrage. And, you know, one thing that people did in protest was they poured French wine in the gutters as an act of kind of protest and disgust at the fact that France wasn't going to go to war in an illegal war, and just said no. And, you know, our neighbor across the street said, you know, after everything we did for them in 1940, and you know, so there was a lot of that kind of rationale knocking around in the States. And then we moved to France, and the French response was to broadcast very gory news footage around the time that your average 7-year-old, me, was like having her bath and getting ready to go to bed, which is not a neutral response, you know. So like I remember footage of, you know, like Iraqi men holding the bloody corpses of their sons, and, you know, like bodies in the backs of pickup trucks, and watching, you know, the shelling of Baghdad and stuff. And then I've been living in the UK for 12 years and seeing how, you know, my Labour friends, or my left of centre friends who love Tony Blair, that's just a massive sore spot, but it all went quite badly wrong in 2003. So I think 9/11 looms quite large in 3 different ways in my upbringing. And also, you know, the day of, so there were 4 planes, as you recall, and the 4th, which was unaccounted for the longest period of time, I think it was meant to come to San Francisco. And we lived in Berkeley at the time, which is in the East Bay. And so, you know, my mum knew that this 4th plane was kind of unaccounted for. And she thought, well, you know, people thought it was going to come and fly into the Golden Gate Bridge. And she thought, well, you know, even if it does that, my kids are going to be okay because we're in the East Bay. So she took us to school because she didn't want us watching the news all day. That's what she was going to do with my dad. And so she took us to school, and there was nobody there. And she took us to our classrooms, and the teachers said, no, school is not closed. You're welcome to leave your children here. But, you know, we've had several parents come and pick their children back up to take them home because they don't think it's safe. And my mum had the quite British response, I think, in hindsight, of saying, well, even if it does fly into the Golden Gate Bridge, like, my kids are going to be safe at school, and I don't want them glued to the news because they're going to see things on the news that I don't want them to. And so that's what we did. But then all of our classmates were back at home glued to the news. And, you know, so I have a memory of, like, we would have drawing time in the afternoons, and, you know, someone on the next desk over from me drawing in felt tip pen of a plane flying into burning buildings and stuff. And my mum seeing this drawing and kind of being horrified. And she managed to, I think we were probably dimly aware, but then my brother, who's always sharper than I am about these kinds of things, a year afterwards, the penny kind of dropped for him, and he said, "But Mummy, were there people on the plane?" And she said it completely broke her heart to have to say yes. And so I think for me, I definitely see 9/11 on a continuum with the Iraq War and the Anglo-American foreign policy that then gave rise to ISIS's prominence, and then the refugee crisis and anti-immigrant sentiment that those all gave rise to. So I think I see them as quite a contiguous historical arc, in a way that I think is, that I think that connection is denied in Anglo-American public life, and very much to our detriment. That was a very waffly answer. I apologize.
An excellent answer. So Stephanie, I think is going to read a little more for us now, and then we will, well, 5-10 minutes or something, give us a chunk, and then we'll do a bit of signing and all that kind of marking afterwards. So yeah. Anyway.
So I'm just going to read from the very, very end of the book. This is the first time that I've read the closing pages of the book aloud, and I'm really excited to do so. And I think it picks up on a lot of what we've just been discussing. Would I live forever in this country? The thought made my throat close in. Its chalky mid-hues, fields like paint sample cards with whimsical names. I will love you all my life. When my mother vowed in the face of those persons then present to commit to my father to the exclusion of all others, that cold day in October with the Assyrian lions and the red buses streaking by, the imminent grapes. My mother was protecting my father from the violence which could come to him in the night or the day, at work or at rest, and take him back to the islands where little love waited for him. My mother was 21, bullish, and knew nothing. It was her boldest act in the time of walls falling. All over the world, my father resents this narrative. He says it was love, which it was. But we must not forget the bodies that eyed this union for a full year after. My parents are brave, and the choices I make will be made in the vault of this precedent. They made us a world where private, witnessed love could win over nations and all the stories they told. They made me richer for all these confusions. My parents made a promise in the face of the state. They stared it down. When asked all the monumental questions, they replied, "I do," between them and those present. But my parents also did something which was within the most primal framework of the state. I proposed something different, a love so unsanctioned, no promises exist for it. Hitherto, society has been underpinned by the institution of marriage, the covenant, the sacrament. It has been used for the warehousing, at its most recent and benign, of intelligent women. I call for a reordering of its ceremonies. I call upon those persons here present today. I solemnly swear. I pledge to relinquish the matrimonial retreat which has ordered us unto this brink. As we hurtle towards the coughing future, I promise to hold tight to you. I promise to hold you up and hold you close and hold you down when you feel you may go spinning off the earth. All that I am, I share with you. I promise my presence in good times and bad, in suchness and even in the eventuality of wealth. I wish you good fortune in the time that we will travel through together, and the changes that we will forgive in ourselves and in others. I promise to stand by your side as we move through changing worlds. I promise to respect you and query you when I am in doubt. I made my friend smile. One of his best smiles, the ones that knock the knees out from under the sun. I had made him a birthday banner. He saw it coming up the garden path. I was in the dining room. He smiled at me. It tackled me sideways, this smile burning into my memory, tackling all my preempts by surprise. My beautiful, beaming friend. I made him smile. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It tackled me sideways. Him smiling on the garden path, turning 23, that flush of love, my friends whom I adore. It stuns me how it runs so deep. I am amazed. How? Where the warning? This friendship form to take. It sloshes in the cup. I swore no solemn oaths. And yet in these times when I brim and spill with grief at the time's consequence, I find myself at the foot of this most sacred undertaking, to love and defend in the present tense, with no deferral or commingling, to be my lone line self and look the monumental questions in the eye, to defend you all until my lungs give out. You have made me gentle, you have made me brave. In these, the weeks of our need, we come to one another on the tides of work and day. We are charging at the best befores of our rage, a most minimum thing this age commands. I will defend you all until my lungs give out. I will love you all my life. All these things being said, it is not always necessary to operate only at the register of vow. You may suffice yourself with subtext and all its crowds. And the bitten truth is this: when I am with you, teleology drops away, and the days need have no given meaning. For in the quiet of your company, I am of consolate closeness, and bristle of it along every pore. And standing by your sides, I feel steadied and prepared to face the yawn of years. Thank you very much. And here's a picture of my parents on their wedding day.
Excellent. Okay, well, you can all